Internal Revenue Service IRS tax news. Self-supporting college students may qualify for an economic impact payment. COVID tax tip 2020-154 November 13, 2020. Any eligible self-supporting college student who doesn't need to file a tax return should register using the non-filer tool by 3 p.m. Eastern Time, November 21st, to receive an economic impact payment before the end of the year. Some college students found themselves in kind of a weird situation with regards to the economic impact payment. So let's kind of recap this situation. Note that the economic impact payment was based on 2019 or 2018 tax returns, even though it's basically tied to the 2020 tax return. In other words, the economic impact payment is basically tied to the 2020 tax return that's going to be filed in 2021, but they wanted to give it out in 2020, so they basically predicted based on prior year tax returns 2019 or 2018. Now, the people that got a payment would basically be anybody with a social security number except somebody that's going to be on someone else's return as a dependent. So if you're on someone else's return as a dependent, then it's possible that the other person, the person that's claiming the dependent, would then get a benefit from it, but it would only be a $500 benefit rather than the $1,200 benefit for one, and only people that are qualifying children, one requirement being under 17, would even qualify for that $500 benefit. Many students then, college students, would be over that threshold. Therefore, parents would not be qualifying for the $500 even if they were a dependent, and they would not get the benefit themselves if they were claimed as a dependent. Now, it's possible you could be in a situation because, again, the economic impact payment, as far as I can see on it, is linked to 2020, even though they used 2019 or 2018 tax returns to basically predict what the economic impact payment and was sent it out. So if you're in a situation where you were claimed as a dependent in 2019 or 2018, and that was what the IRS used in order to calculate the economic impact payment, it's quite possible that there was no economic impact payment that was received either by you or the parent for it. However, if in 2020, for whatever reason, you're now going to file your own tax return and not be claiming as a dependent, and you're now, quote, self-supporting, end quote, then you may be qualifying for the economic impact payment, and the IRS wouldn't have known about that due to the fact that they're basing their information on 2019 and 2018 return, even though the economic impact payment is really tied to 2020, which is going to be filed in 2021. So if you were basically a dependent last year on your parents' tax returns in 2019 or 2018, you possibly, quite likely, didn't get an economic impact payment. Quite likely, your parents didn't get an economic impact payment. If in 2020, for example, you are now not a dependent, going to file your own tax return and not be claimed as a dependent because you're self-supporting at that point, then it's quite possible that maybe you would qualify for the $1,200 economic impact payment. Okay, so back to the text. Generally, a self-supporting student who registers will receive a $1,200 payment if they are single, or $2,400 if married and file a joint return, and the student or their spouse cannot be claimed as a dependent. If they have dependent children, they may also get an additional $500 for each qualifying child. Only self-supporting students who are not required to file a tax return should use the non-filer tool. Dependent students do not qualify. This means any student who is claimed as a dependent by their parents or someone else cannot get a payment. So if you're being claimed as a dependent, which is quite likely as a student, because you might be claimed as a dependent as a student, then you wouldn't qualify for the economic impact payment, and once again, the parent probably wouldn't even get the $500 because you'd be over the $17 threshold to be a qualifying child. However, if you were a dependent in the prior year and possibly self-supporting in the current year, filing your own tax return in the current year and not being claimed as a dependent, then maybe you would qualify for the $1,200 economic impact payment in the current year, which would be filing for 2020, which would be actually filed in 2021. So recent college graduates may not have received an economic impact payment because they were claimed as a dependent by their parent or someone else. If their situation changes, these graduates may be eligible for the recovery rebate credit when they file their 2020 tax return in 2021. So that's going to be that situation again. If it was in the prior year, you're in a situation where you were claimed as a dependent. In the current year, you're not a dependent. Then you might be able to file or get the economic impact payment when you file the tax return for 2020, which you'll actually file in 2021. because again, the economic impact payment is supposed to kind of be somewhat tied to 2020. Any kind of problems with the economic impact payment distributions that happen based on prior year tax returns should, as far as I can see, be reconciled with the filing of the 2020 tax return, which would actually be filed in 2021. People who don't normally file a tax return may be able to register an economic impact payment quickly using the non-filer tool on the IRS. Students who need to or want to file a regular tax return should not use the non-filer tool. So if you're going to be filing a regular tax return, they're saying don't use the non-filer tool because you will confuse the IRS. But if you're under the threshold to file a tax return, you don't need to file a tax return, then you might want to use the non-filer tool in order to process and get the information to the IRS. Note that if you're under the threshold to need to file a tax return, then you may still want to file it, because if you had any income, any taxable income, you might have had withholdings on it. Number one, the withholdings might be small, so you might say, well, it's not really worth my time to file due to the small withholdings, but you could qualify for, say, an earned income credit, possibly if you're filing your own tax return, and you might qualify if you have a qualifying child. Those are credits that go beyond the paying of the tax. They're not really a tax at all. They're more of a support program, and so those are called, quote, refundable credits, end quote, that could go beyond the actual tax that was paid. So therefore, even if you're not required to file the tax return, you may want to file the tax return and see if you qualify for any of those credits. So back to the text. This includes any student who had federal income tax withheld for pay and wants to file a tax return to claim a refund. Working students who have a summer or part-time job should consider filing a tax return so they can receive potential federal tax refund. Anyone using the non-filer tool can speed up the arrival of their payment by choosing to receive it by direct deposit. Those not choosing this option will get a check. People can track the status of their payment using the Get My Payment tool. There's a link to the Get My Payment tool here. Starting 2 weeks after they register, anyone who misses the November 21st deadline will have to wait until next year to claim the recovery rebate credit if they're eligible when they file their 2020 federal income tax return. So let's take a look at that one more time. Anyone who misses the November 21st deadline, which is the deadline to use the non-filer tool, that would be for people typically that aren't filing a tax return, that you can give to the IRS just the information needed so that they can process. Then if you miss that deadline, you will have to wait till next year to claim the recovery rebate credit if they're eligible when they file their 2020 tax return. So if you don't hit that one, then when you file the 2020 tax return, again, if you're not a dependent, if you're self-supporting at that point in time, then you may be able to get basically the economic impact payment in the form of a recovery rebate credit at that point in time. So more information can be found below in the links below in the Economic Impact Payment Information Center and a closer look. There's links to those here. There'll be a link to this in the description.